Your new book is called Translating Hell. It seems that you are generally tracking the theme of like Apocrypha in the early medieval churches of Europe. What is Apocrypha, though? Because it gets used a lot in different ways. How would you define it?
Yeah, sure. I'm glad you asked because, yeah, like you said, there are quite a few uses of Apocrypha, so disentangling them is really helpful. Uh, um, I define Apocrypha as non-canonical scriptures, so they are writings that look and sound like scripture, but they were not universally or not for a long time held to be canonical, right, or authoritative in the way that the other 66 or 72 books of scripture, depending on your tradition, would be, right? So they look and sound like scripture. They're written in a lot of the same genres. We have apocryphal Pauline epistles. We have apocryphal historical books from the Old Testament. We have basically any genre that you see in the Bible. Those were the mold. And then apocrypha were often written in imitation of those genres. Of course, I'm oversimplifying, and I'm sure New Testament or Hebrew Bible scholars would come in and say, well, actually, these texts existed in sort of a complex network at the time, right? When they were originally written. To flip the question, someone like Bart Ehrman might say that, well, the canonical texts are just the apocryphal texts that were popular enough that they were widely adopted, right? But for our purposes, looking from the standpoint of the early Middle Ages, when Christianity is a dominant cultural force, I would say that Apocrypha are non-canonical scriptures. That's how a lot of people like Bede or Alfrich or Aldhelm were thinking about them, right? Um, and that usage is different from what some people in the audience might have heard, right? Sometimes we talk about the Roman Catholic Bible having apocryphal books in them. I have a copy somewhere on my shelf over here of the Apocrypha put out by Longman's Press, right? And it's like the Book of Judith or Tobit or Wisdom, right? Properly, those are considered the deuterocanonical books, right? The
Yeah.
other canon. So that's sort of calling those Apocrypha is basically recycling a Reformation era polemic against the Catholic Church, right?
Right. Why do people make Apocrypha?
That's a good question as well. One thing that I tried to arrive at in my book was thinking about the amount of the kind of creative labor that can go into making Apocrypha and the sorts of results that come from generating texts like these. So one thing that I have argued about Apocrypha is that because they look and sound like scripture, some people felt free to revere them as, spiritually edifying, as like canonical gospel truth, basically, right? But since they were not canonical, some people felt free to revise them, right? If you read enough apocryphal texts across enough manuscripts, right? Not like standard critical editions, but like what's actually in individual codices, right? You can actually see some of these legends growing, shaping, changing shape over the years. They'll acquire new layers as they go, right? You can see which ones are related to each other through this kind of scholarship. So you can see that it's sort of an active tradition that Apocrypha sort of gather accretions to themselves. They get longer, they get more elaborated. Sometimes a scribe will take an apocryphal uh, episode from one tradition and bring it into another tradition for the first time. Um, and so by this process, like these sorts of I hesitate to call them Bible fan fiction, but it is. I think the comparison is not without its merits, right? Even though I
Yeah.
wouldn't argue for it myself, but it's the idea that people are emotionally invested in the Bible, in those texts and those stories, and you can imagine, especially if someone like if this is their faith and their faith tradition, they're even more invested in it because those stories are tied up in their own personal narrative about salvation and how they belong in the world and like what's the purpose of their life, right? The stories have the power to sort of reshape those kinds of identity making issues. And so if you write an apocryphal text, you could potentially be reshaping someone's entire worldview, depending on what you put in there and what emphasis, what is sort of the ramifications of your apocryphal text.
Yeah. I really like the story of Peter and Paul. Specifically, I was recently reading Alfred's homily on the
Uh-huh.
Passion of Peter and Paul. And it's so interesting to me because a lot of Catholics, or I think a lot of Christians in general, will agree on sort of the big bullet points of how Peter and Paul died. Like,
Mhm.
okay, Paul was executed because he was a Roman citizen. Peter was crucified upside down because he didn't want to be crucified in the same way as Christ. And they were both, persecuted by the Romans in the city of Rome. Like those things are kind of like agreed upon. The sort of way in which it happened, though, when you read Alfred's account, this is, a late 10th century, maybe early 11th century account of in England, and you can see in the critical editions like where he's getting all these different parts of the story from. But there's like this wizard that flies around and like challenges
Simon
them to
Magus.
like magic duels and stuff like that. And like Peter like is like whispering in Nero's ear and like trying to trick him and so, and like dogs appear out of nowhere and it's like all these like crazy stories.
Yep.
And I think most modern Christians would probably be like, yeah, that's a lot of that's just made up. But where's the line at that point? And it's really interesting to see the sort of evolution over the years. That was what a lot of the material in your book was reminding me of.
Yeah, and I think what you're pointing to is something that I personally value, right? We could look at people in the past and just say, well, it was a different time. They were simpletons, right? They didn't know stuff
Hmm.
like we do. And I don't like that perspective. Before I came to English, I was an anthropology major as an undergrad, and
Oh.
so like you wouldn't say that about people today, right? I hope
Hmm.
you wouldn't be like, oh, such and such ethnicity, they're just simple people. Like, no, that's what people were saying in the 19th century, for, colonial reasons, right? It wouldn't be cool to do that now because we know that that's not true. Why is it okay to do that about people in the past, right? And so thinking about sort of the curiosity that people had about these narratives, about these characters who are super important to their own sense of self and self-understanding, right? If Paul is the guy who is the evangelist who basically is the only reason that the Gentiles could become Christians in the first place. You might want to know more about Paul's life, right? You get snippets of
Yeah.
it from the canonical epistles, but how did it end, right? Martyrdom was a huge deal in the late antique and early medieval church. Surely someone as important as him should have a cool martyr story, right?
Yeah.
Same for Peter, right? If Peter founded the church at Rome, right? He's the rock upon whom Christ builds the church. And the English really love thinking of themselves as I think Aldhelm calls uh, Pope Gregory the Great Ure Faster Father, right? Our foster
Mm.
father, because he, the Pope from Rome, sent the missionaries who first preached in England, right? And so they saw as sort of like almost like a family relationship between themselves and Rome. So surely Peter, right, should also have a cool story, right? Because he's at the head
Yeah.
of that whole tradition. You want
Hmm.
these sorts of figures to have heroic lives, and Apocrypha allow you to sort of ask and answer those kinds of questions. Sometimes apocrypha are just, I think, grow out of curiosity. If you look at like something in Genesis, right? Adam lives to be 930 something years old, right? Um, my first question when I read that as a child was, what do you do for that long? Right? What does that life look like?
Yeah.
There are apocrypha that answer that question, right?
Mm.
Because I think other people had the exact same reaction. 930, that's a long time, right? So we need the Vita Adi et Evae, right? The life of Adam and Eve,
Hmm.
which becomes very popular. It sort of fuses with the Gospel of Nicodemus in some weird ways later. But it talks about they farmed, it was horrible. Their kids fought. Eventually, they killed each other, right? By the end of Adam's days, he is super sad. And some of these texts say that he never laughed or smiled his whole life because he had been in paradise, right? And everything
Right.
after getting kicked out of Eden was horrible compared to that. He just wanted to die, or he didn't want to die. It was there's split opinions. But anyway, it's people you can see real Christians sort of trying to imagine answers to texts that are raised by the canonical text but can't possibly be answered by that.
Yeah. Your book mentions often the manner in which England was converted, the sort of unique aspects of England's conversion. Could you speak a bit to that? Like, when Christianity comes to England, how does Apocrypha figure into the story?
Yes, that is a difficult question to answer, and I'm glad you asked it. Um, so the easy part is when did England convert? Traditionally, right, 597 is
Hmm.
when Pope Gregory the Great sends the other Augustine, right, lowercase
Yeah,
Augustine,
Augustine of
to
Canterbury. Yeah.
yeah, not of Hippo, to Canterbury to Kent, right? Trying to win over Athelbert and his household. Now, of course, he has a natural advantage because Athelbert's wife is already a Christian, so he has a sympathetic audience right off the bat. But anyway, that's when they traditionally convert is from 597 onwards, and then it's as Bede portrays it, right? Bede is one of our only sources for this time period. He sort of portrays it as like the conversion of England is sort of a slow, decade by decade northern progression of the faith, right? Up until we get to Northumbria, and then we don't worry about Scotland because, right, who knows what goes on up there. But yeah, so and of course he also shows that there are setbacks, right? There are kings like Penda who rear their heads and try to force the Christians out and things like that. It's not an uncontested, smooth process, but it is sort of a slow triumph, right? Which is glorious for the church in its own way, right? I think as he depicts it, because it shows it wasn't easy, but that God guided it from start to
Yeah.
finish. The question, I think, as you've put it, is why would they want Apocrypha in that scenario? Um, One of the things that makes England's conversion interesting historically is simply how early it happens,
Mhm.
and the fact that it already like well, okay. It's not a second conversion. It is the first conversion for these Anglo-Saxons and Jutes, right? But before they came over in the fifth or maybe even late fourth century, right? Archaeologists are moving that date around lately, but it's getting pushed earlier than Bede would like us to believe. But anyway, whenever they came over, right before that, there were all these Romanized Celts who lived across the island, and they
Right.
had Christianity from the 300s. We have evidence for, right? Um, so there's already a church, and if you've seen some of the Roman villa mosaics, right? There are some that still survive to this day that have like a giant Cairo, right? Those would have been there when the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes were stomping around practicing their heathenism, right?
Yeah.
Um, so that's one of the things that makes this conversion, I think, interesting is that you already have some Christians in the mix, although they're very marginalized and they're hiding out in what is now Wales, right? And then you have this large heathen center. Um, it makes it a much more contested and sort of back and forth process, I think, than maybe it's often taught in like history books, right? Because of that, and maybe this is true of all times and places, right? I'm thinking off the top of my head now. I don't know that conversion is ever like, an instant. It's not like someone flips a light switch and suddenly everyone in the region is Christian,
Yeah.
right? But yeah, in England, I think it's especially rocky at first because there are so many little kingdoms and chieftains, and there are multiple centers of power, right? Just because some king down in Kent has converted doesn't mean anything to the Mercians or Northumbrians or whatever, right?
Right.
The Witcher, or whoever else. So there's that. Um, at the same time, though, we have a papal-sponsored missionary program coming straight from Rome, straight from the seat of learning, right? Um, and bookmaking, well, one of the seats at this point in history. And so you have a sort of well-funded missionary program when Theodore and Hadrian come on up after the first wave of conversion, right? They bring a lot of books with them. And they're also fluent in Greek, which is virtually unheard of in the early Middle Ages in this corner of Europe for a long time, right? They're bringing all sorts of firsthand knowledge of the Middle East because they're from, I'm gonna get this right. Hadrian is from North Africa. Um, Theodore is from Tarsus, right? So basically Paul's backyard. Anyway, they're both coming from very like the southern and the eastern edges of the Mediterranean, right? There would be no English church without them and the learning that they bring without their not only, are they fluent in Latin, of course, which I guess would be the only way they could have talked to people at first. I don't know what it would have been like for them to learn Old English. I've never really thought about that. But they're also fluent in Greek. They're also fluent
Uh-huh.
in whatever native languages they grew up with, right? We don't know a ton about that. But anyway, it's their learning and their expertise that really gets England to the point where by Bede's day, Monk Wearmouth Jarrow is like, Northumbria is the seat of learning, of, a very specific kind of Christian learning, as of the year 700. That couldn't have happened without them. And without, I think, lots of connections to places where late antique, late classical learning had been cultivated, right, in the south and in the east of the Mediterranean. Um, so you get an influx of scholars and books from those regions. And I think that is one way in which Apocrypha would have traveled to early medieval England, is that you have someone importing books from these regions. And if you dabble in any of the church traditions of, say, the Syriac Orthodox Church or the Coptic Church or the Ethiopic Orthodox Church, right? You'll notice like the Ethiopic tradition has 78 books in it. There are a lot of things in those traditions that have been considered canonical for a millennium and a half, that Western, traditions have said are apocryphal. So just right there, you've got things that would have been considered completely non-controversial, right? Like, say, the books of Enoch, that would have been totally normal for Theodore and Hadrian, probably. But then they
Yeah.
get to England and they're in a region where eventually those will be considered suspect books, because they're not canonical. So there's that dynamic. It's also worth thinking about the nature of libraries at this point, and the fact that you and I are both have our credibility bookshelves behind us. Although they're also functional, right? Um,
Yeah.
we like to store our books upright. We like to have lots of them. This would have
Mhm.
been completely unrecognizable to Bede, right? I think Michael Lappage in the Anglo-Saxon Library, which is a fantastic, dense book. But he says that Monk Guermothichero at its height probably only had 250 volumes, like codices.
Yeah.
That would fit on one of these two shelves behind me, right?
Yeah,
Um,
doesn't he suggest that they were like literally stored in like a chest that you could like,
yes,
oh,
yeah, yeah.
like you can go and look in the chest and maybe get a book out. Like
Yeah,
and
that's
that's like
exactly right,
that's
right?
like
So
the
like,
library.
yeah, yeah, yeah. People in late antiquity would have called these things armoria, right? Which
Uh,
gives us our French word armoire, right? And they would have had little doors on them, like the one in the Codex Amiatinus illustration, right? Those
mhm.
were mostly a Roman thing, and as far as we know, they didn't use those in England, not until after the conquest, right?
Mhm.
So they would have had book chests, is what they called them, or arca in Latin, right? An ark, a chest.
Yeah.
And yeah, so like if you got these little boxes, they probably only hold 25 volumes each. Um, they're storing them in the boxes, closed to protect them from the elements and protect them
Mhm.
from um, varmint, right? Critters, bugs,
Yeah.
bookworms, as the Mothe riddle from the Exeter book would remind us, right?
Mhm.
Um, at any rate, not only does a library look different to them, but the codex is also serving a pretty different purpose from what we're used to, right? I mean, look at all the lobes on your shelf, right? They're organized by author. Yeah, you should just appreciate those for what they are. They're organized by author, right? You've got Horace, and in those two volumes, you've got everything that Horace wrote. That is not how they were organizing their books, right? Their codices were much more on the Florilegium model, the sort of miscellany model where you've got a bunch of texts that are considered useful. Maybe they're considered conceptually related. Maybe you have a codex that is like history, but it's kind of a kitchen drawer, grab bag of like, well, I've got a little bit of Isidore in here. I've got a little bit of relevant portions of Augustine's City of God. And then I've got like this weird Latin summary of the Iliad, right? Because that's all they knew of
Yeah.
Homer. Um, and so like that volume is going to be unique. There's no other one like it, right? Unless its exemplar was exactly like that. And so for you as a monk, if you're reading that text, that is what you know of world history, right? But the same thing is going to be true of Apocrypha. Apocrypha often get wedged into these books alongside other more authoritative books. And I will argue in an article that'll probably come out in 3 years, right? Because that's how slow academic publishing is.
Yeah.
But I'm arguing that I think that's one reason why Apocrypha becomes so influential is because they're often sandwiched in manuscripts alongside clearly authoritative voices, right? You got a bunch
Mhm.
of sermons from Alfred or Augustine, and then you've got some weird Blickling homily or Blickling type homilies sandwiched in there. Who are you to say that those aren't valid, right? Are you discerning enough to know that those, are theologically suspect? Or even if you have someone like Alfred who clearly comes out against Apocrypha, right? He said, like, he actually, I talk about it in the book. He comes out, he ridicules the vision of St. Paul by name, right? And says, this is a ridiculous book and people shouldn't read it because it's spiritually dangerous.
Yeah.
And he even raises the logical contradiction in First Corinthians 12 when Paul says, I was taken up, well, He says, I know a guy who was taken up to the third heaven. He's talking about himself, and saw
Yeah.
mystical visions and revelations, but I'm not allowed to say anything. I'm not allowed to repeat any of it, right? And Alfred
Yeah.
points to that and says, he said he can't talk about it. So how can we have a vision of St. Paul where he talks about it?
Yeah. And then I changed my mind. Here's what happened.
Right. Yeah, it turns out it was too important, and you people really need to know about heaven and hell after all. Um,
Yeah.
and
It
so,
reminds me a
so,
lot of Irish scholar. I was recently reading a lot of early medieval Irish scholars were named things like Augustine, and so
Mhm.
they would like write something that they thought of, and then they would say like this was written by Augustine, and then other scholars would take and be like, oh my God, like Augustine said this,
Mhm.
and they wouldn't understand that it's not like the Augustine, it's just some random Irish monk.
And now when
That
you
that
go
kind of
through
thing
scholarship,
seems,
you have to
yeah,
find stuff by pseudo Augustine or
yeah,
pseudo Ambrose or whatever. That's where all those pseudos are coming from. Pseudo Isidore is another famous one. It could just be they're naming themselves after some of their favorites, right?
hmm
Or it could be, I guess these aren't exclusive. It could be both. Authority worked differently back then, right?
hmm
C.S. Lewis in The Discarded Image talks a lot about the commonplaces of late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, things that were taken for granted, right? That don't make sense to us anymore, right? When we publish something new, when we write something groundbreaking and brilliant, for example, like this, we put our name on it, right? um,
uh-huh,
because we want to be we believe in sort of the cult of the individual genius and the author, right? These are things that only happen after 13 1400, right? In the early middle ages, um, novelty was kind of distrusted in and of itself. Chaucer has a fun poem about newfangledness, he calls it, where he talks about how you really can't trust new stuff. And that was sort of the general attitude, right? Even though he's at sort of this liminal period where he is putting his name on everything. He does want to be famous and remembered. He's
Well,
very
you mean the word for like sedition in Latin was like novis rebus studens.
yeah,
Like you're looking at new things. You're interested in new things. Like that's bad.
right.
People who studied novis rebus were bad.
Right. Yeah, yeah. Our word author comes from the Latin auctoritas, right? An authority. That is what an
Yeah.
author is. They are someone
hmm
who has authority and who deserves it. So if I write something brilliant and I want other people to read it and take it seriously, I should put someone else's name on it, like Ambrose or Augustine, because that's who people trust, right? So it's an open
Yeah.
question
Yeah.
about how deliberate that is, but the pattern is definitely there, right?
hmm
It's very rare that we get someone like, John Scotus Erugena, right? Or however you want to say his name. Um, where there's an individual person who says something unusual and their name is attached to it, right?
Yeah.
Anselm of Canterbury is one of the first in the English tradition, after Bede and Alfred, whose name is attached to it, right?
hmm
Cunewulf, right? So there's a few people, but by and large, there's many more anonymous homilies, anonymous treatises, where we just don't have a name, and that's because I guess they didn't really think it was worth preserving, right? They thought the
Yeah.
message was more important than the messenger. And they didn't really have the cult of the author in the same way that we do,
hmm Would love to know the
which
Beowulf
allows, I
quotes,
think, that
for
anonymity
example.
allows for more apocrypha to be generated to bring
Yeah.
that conversation back to, yeah.
So one theme that you develop is, or mention at least, is that the a lot of English sources refer to them. I don't think explicitly. They certainly seem to think of themselves as a sort of continuation of Israel.
Mhm.
Um, what does that have to play in this whole situation?
Yes, that's an important thread throughout this particular chapter in the book. Andy Scheil was the one who wrote the In the Footsteps of Israel book. It's a great monograph that studies sort of how does Bede articulate a vision of history in which the English understand themselves as a second Israel,
hmm
just like Israel. If you read the Exodus narrative in particular, sorry, I'm close to a hospital. I don't know if you can hear the ambulance. Um, But if you look at Bede or if you look at Exodus, right, the story of Israel is that they were enslaved in Egypt, and then God raised up Moses, who delivered them through the waters to a promised land that they then had to fight a bunch of wars in, and eventually that becomes their promised land, right?
Yeah.
And Bede looks at that story and sort of typologically, maybe we should talk about what typology is, but he uses typology as a mode of reading to map out how that's also England's story, right? They too were lost in slavery to heathendom, right? And
hmm
then God raised up a prophet figure like Augustine of Canterbury to come and preach to them. And they were led over the waters to a new land, right, from North Germany to England, right, to take possession of this place where they're constantly fighting with the Welsh and the Picts or whoever, right? And eventually, if they obey God and keep His law, they will get to keep that land just like the Israelites were supposed to under the Mosaic law, right? Um,
Yeah.
so they very much
Well,
saw
how would you
themselves.
define? Oh, go ahead.
Oh, were you going to ask about typology?
Yeah, how would you define typology?
Sorry, it's like one of those things that I'm thinking about all the time, but I realize most people have lives.
Uh,
Typology is a mode of, I would say, late antique, early Christian reading, where you look at especially events that happen in the Bible, specifically in the Hebrew Bible, or what they would have thought of as their Old Testament,
mhm.
and they're thinking about the Bible as sort of a grand narrative of world history, right? And so they would look at events in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible and say, we have these stories because they foreshadow important truths that will be fulfilled later, either by Christ or by the church, right? And so you get things like the whole mode of reading actually emerges from Paul is one of the first people to do it. In First Corinthians, he says that I think it's First Corinthians 10, where he says that God led the Israelites through the Red Sea to salvation, and that is a type, is the word he uses for Christian baptism. And so a type in the Greek there, the tupos is the word, is like literally like a die, like that you would stamp something with, right? Like a seal or something like that, right? And so he's imagining basically that you have a stamp, with an image carved on one end of it. And so like there's the type, the stamp, and then there's the thing that you stamp. And so, like, when God gives a revelation to humanity through an actual concrete historical event, there's the event itself, but then there's the reverberation or the image of it that is stamped. And that second image is is the fulfillment of the type and the antitype.
That's a
And
great
so, like,
explanation.
oh, thanks. I stole it from Eric Auerbach, who wrote the definitive essay on typology.
Hmm.
And it's really great. You should read it. But it's thinking about, yeah. So there's lots of events that are sort of fulfilled or typologically echo truths that happen later, right? When David, the apocryphal Psalm 151 is considered very important in the medieval church because it's one where David, as a boy, supposedly composed this 5 minutes after lopping off Goliath's head. Um, and it's supposed to be a type for Christ triumphing over death and Satan and sin, right? And so, Noah's Ark is another one that is commonly pointed to in medieval exegesis, right? Where they say, this is a type of how God uses the church to save lots of people, but not all people, and maybe not even the majority of people, right? Because it's just Noah and his seven family members, and everybody else drowns. Um, yeah, they would look at these things and they would spend a lot of time trying to read these sort of extra literal typological resonances into biblical texts. And they also did it with Apocrypha with interesting results.
Yeah, I do think it's really interesting how Gildas, the first account we get of the Adventus Saxonum, so to
Hmm.
speak, clearly thinks that the Britons are Israel, right? And he's clearly describing them as like for their sins they were punished by God. But then when Bede repurposes that story, he basically repeats almost like a huge chunk of what Gildas says. But when he says it, it's very clear that he thinks that the Britons like kind of lost their chance and they had
Yes.
to cede the territory to like the real Israel, which were the English. That's like
Yes.
such an interesting little turn that he does there.
Well, and it's I think by the end of this chapter in my book, like I think I hope I show that Bede is also worried that the same thing is going to happen to them, right?
Mm.
Wulfstan, right? The reason he writes Sermo Lupiat Anglo, but I guess Bede is before the Vikings, so he's like quietly worried about it in his own way, right? And this is why he ends
Wolfstone
his
for sure, though. I
ecclesiastical history.
definitely agree with you on that.
Yeah, I mean, yes, the English have sort of an identity crisis after the Vikings, right? They thought that they were the second Israel, and then all this really bad stuff happens, especially churches, right? I mean, you can read Alcuin's letter about Lindisfarne, right?
Hmm.
I think that's why he's so terrified is he sees churches specifically getting leveled, and it reminds him of what happens right before the Babylonian exile, right?
Yeah.
And he thinks, oh my gosh, it's happening here. We screwed up so bad that God is letting the heathens, trample us and they're going to take us over the waters as slaves, which is not unlikely when you're dealing with Vikings, right? He knew what he was worried about. He knew what he was talking about.
Yeah.
So they're reading their own historical moment, even typologically, right?
Mhm.
Because they think of themselves as a new Israel. So yeah, by the time you get to Wolfston's Sermo Lupi, that's what he's preaching against. He's saying we got to get our act together fast because like we're halfway through the like, we're at the midpoint of being exiled right here. We will lose our land to these Danes if we don't get it together and make God happy again.
Yeah, it's easy to forget that they were living in that time. They couldn't like look back and see like, oh, everything turned out fine, England survived the Viking invasions at the end of the day. Like they didn't know that that was going to happen. It's very easy for me to forget that these people theoretically, like the Vikings could have just kept going and going and going and just killed everyone in England. Like
Yeah.
that was theoretically possible.
And at
And
one
for all
point,
they
at
knew,
multiple
that was
points, you have Viking kings who become king of England, right? What is
yeah.
Canute other than that?
Yeah. I mean, he was Christian though. Correct me if I'm
Yes, and
wrong.
he makes a big show of, I mean, I think he goes out of his way. I think Levi Roach argues quite compellingly that one reason Canute has to go out of his way to show just how Christian he is because everyone is worried about this. They're worried
Yeah.
that a heathen Dane, is on the throne, and what is that going to mean for all of us, right?
Yeah.
Um, he's like, no, 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 it's cool, it's cool. I'm one of you. I'm one of you. Just let's all take communion. Let's all be friends.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, while we're talking about the Norse, I liked your conversation with Jackson Crawford. By the way, if anyone's wondering, we had set this up before that happened, so I'm not just copying him. But when I talked to him a weekend later, and he brought up again the sort of Norse Apocrypha. I think he really enjoyed reading it again, and he found it so sort of like telling on the Norse sort of psyche. And I was wondering, what would you say is the difference if the Norse have their sort of their take on Apocrypha that just demonstrates like, oh, like who was suffering best in hell, like who's manliest about being like a damned pagan.
Yeah.
What is the sort of English counter to that? How are they different in that regard?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And that is kind of how I structured the chapter. So yeah, so I think what I argue about the Norse in general is not only is they're basically working through some of the same preoccupations you see in the sagas, they're also thinking about those with Apocrypha, right? So they're worried
Hmm.
about manly virtue and like who the toughest warriors are, right? But also they're worried about how to honor the memory of their ancestors. And so
Hmm.
that is why I think Niðurstyggðar saga becomes so important for them, is because it shows, by making Christ catch the Midgard serpent on the fish hook, they're making Christ typologically parallel to Thor, right? They're saying that Christ is the true and better Thor. But that also implies that all of their heathen myths of their ancestors are not trash. They don't have to get rid of them. It means that they are actually sort of muddy revelations from God, right?
Yeah.
Um, just like the Old Testament it's a local Old Testament, right? Just like the Old Testament, it was not a perfect revelation, right? We see through a glass darkly, as Paul says. And it's the Israelites didn't totally understand everything that was being revealed to them, is what medieval Christians would say.
Yeah.
Then, our heathen myths were like that too, right? God was trying to show us that there was going to be a harrowing of hell. And so that is why we had these myths about Thor killing the Midgard serpent, right?
Hmm.
And so it sort of allows them to have it both ways. It allows them to grandfather in their ancestors, right, into salvation and into, I think it's why they're allowed to keep their myths when pretty much no other Germanic people is allowed, right? That's what I argue. But for the English, to answer your question, I think the English are much more worried about what we've been talking about with Gildas and Bede and following in the footsteps of Israel, sort of this identity. It's not exactly a national identity, but an identity that sees the land and the people as importantly linked, right? Um, they don't really think of themselves as the English per se, right? They would have said, I'm an Engle or I live in Mercia or whatever, right? But still, they are worried about the people who speak this Old English language getting exiled and dragged off somewhere else, right? Or
Yeah.
getting dispossessed because they knew about Gildas, they knew about the Welsh, right? Or who became the Welsh. They knew that those guys used to live all across this land and they lost it for reasons. that they would say was, they fell out of divine favor or whatever, right?
Yeah,
Which I'm sure that the Welsh did not appreciate and still do not appreciate, right? In fact, I also talk about that in my Welsh chapter, is that there's plenty of Welsh texts that use Apocrypha to say one day Jesus is going to come back and finish the harrowing of hell, and he's going to drive all of you English monsters and Anglo-Norman monsters out of here, and we will have our land back. Maybe Arthur will come back too. But so you can see that everyone's sort of playing with these myths in the same way,
yeah.
or in comparable way, locally relevant ways. But yeah, so the English are using Apocrypha to sort of work out, I think, some of their anxieties about belonging, about who does
Hmm.
belong, who counts as English, who counts as Christian. Um, we could talk about specific examples, right, with Jamnes and Mambres, with the vision of St. Paul, with Christ and Satan. But I think that they are trying to think through their own, if you read Old English poetry, exile is a bad thing, right? There
Hmm.
are many elegies written about how miserable it is to be in exile. Christ and Satan is sort of imagining Satan as an exile from heaven because of his failed
Right.
rebellion, right? So I think it's especially useful for them to sort of work out, how do we stay in God's favor, since Scripture doesn't quite address these issues directly.
Mhm. So I would actually like to talk about some of these examples that you bring up. Jamnes and Mambres, the first one that you mentioned in the book. Well, after the bead visions. The bead visions are
Mhm.
pretty cool, but I think perhaps more to talk about with this Jamnes and Mambres piece. I had never heard of it before. I mean, that was a crazy pull. That an Old English text that I had never even heard of, much less read. But I really enjoyed it. It was nice and short for someone who knows nothing about Yamnes and Mambres, which I'm going to assume is actually rather quite a few people. What is this story? Where does it come from?
Yeah, so and to be fair to everyone else, I hadn't heard of it either until I filed my dissertation proposal, and I remember Rob Folk was like, "Oh, by the way, do you know about the penitence of Yamnes and Mambres?" And I was like, "No, I thought it was a penitential." Anyway, and I read it and I was like, "Oh my gosh, this is perfect. He's right. He's
Yeah.
always right." So yeah, so Yamnes and Mambres, this is an especially weird apocryphal category. I hesitate to call it an apocryphon because we actually don't. We may have an apocryphal text about these guys. We know that there's a tradition about them in late antiquity, and even before, like even in the century, the Second Temple era, right, of Judaism, there are legends about Yamnes and Mambres. Back then, they were called Yanes and Yambres. So these are supposed to be the court magicians of Pharaoh who withstand Moses and Aaron when Moses and Aaron are, performing the signs and wonders, trying to
Yeah. They
convince
sing a
Pharaoh to
song
let.
in Prince of Egypt.
Yeah, exactly, right? Yeah, yeah, they're in the Prince of Egypt.
Yeah.
Although I don't know that they're named in Prince of Egypt. I don't
I
think they
don't think
are.
they are.
Yeah,
No, but they
but
do
they
have a
could have
pretty
been.
cool song.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, they have a cool song and they turn rods into snakes and vice versa.
Yeah.
And they're actually depicted that way in the Old English Hexateuch, if you have time to look it up. They're actually drawn doing the snake trick with their
Oh, that's
staffs.
cool.
The illustrator's not very good, so it's not a very good picture. But they're there. Anyway, so these guys are not mentioned in the book of Exodus at all, right? If you read your Bible carefully, you'll be like, who? Um, So they're not mentioned there. The only place they are mentioned in canonical scriptures is in First Timothy 3, where the author of that Pauline letter, right? That's not one of the firm seven. It's, you know, New Testament scholars would say that that is a Pauline letter rather than one by Paul. Anywho,
Mm.
whoever
Yeah.
wrote that thing, he says that there are people who withstand his ministry and they get in the way of the spreading of the gospel, and they are like Yanes or Yanes and Yambres. And that they should be sort of cast aside, right? Kicked out of the church because they're just troublemakers and magicians. That's the only canonical reference we get to these guys. So what's interesting there, first off, is that we get a canonical book quoting or alluding to an apocryphal tradition, right?
Yeah.
The only other time I know of that happening in the New Testament is in Jude, where they reference the giants in Enoch.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, yeah. So there are a couple of weird moments like that. But anyway, it shows you that these texts emerged from really complicated networks originally that have been lost to the sands of time. But
Mhm.
so Yanes and Yambres are known canonically only from that Pauline letter, First Timothy. The English seem to have read them backwards into Exodus, right? Because they're the guys who withstood Moses and Aaron, and I think we've
Yeah.
already covered. pretty well in this conversation that the Exodus narrative is really important to the English conception of selfhood, right? They
Hmm.
are the second Israel, they're following in those footsteps. It's so important, in fact, that when we get the Old English Orosius, translation of Orosius, the Old English translator adds in Jamnes and Mambres. They are not in the Latin version, in the Latin original at all, but they feel like they have to add them in twice. First, at the confrontation at Pharaoh's court, and then secondly, he gives them a really cool death scene where they are standing in the middle of the Red Sea trying to use their magic to hold the water up as it
Yes, I
crashes
remember
down and
reading this.
destroys them all. Yeah, yeah, it's
It
awesome.
was crazy.
Completely made up, right? And also different from the other Yamnes and Mambes traditions where that's not how they die. Like that can't be
Hmm.
how they die in the text that I'm about to talk about because Mambres is still alive years later and his
Yeah.
brother has been dead for many years, right? So that couldn't
Mhm.
happen. They were not bothered by the discrepancy. I will throw it out there that we know that there was a Greek apocryphon about these guys. It did not survive in the West at all, right?
Mhm.
There's no Latin evidence for it at all. And the only reason we even know about it is because a guy named Albert Pietersma, I don't know if that's how you pronounce his name, looked through the Chester Beatty papyrus fragments and reassembled them very painstakingly in the early 90s. So if you want to read that version, it's like a late antique romance almost about these brothers and all the tricks they did. It's like novella length. It's surprisingly long. Um, None of that seems to have been known in Latin speaking or Latin writing regions at all. Um, so I think someone in England not only interjected these brothers back into the Exodus narrative, but also said there should be a story about them and made up the story, the penitence of Yamnes and Mambres.
Yeah.
Um, because that text shows up without any antecedents at all. It's only one page in the manuscript that we have it in. In fact, it's really only a half a page because it's the Latin with the Old English right after it.
Mhm.
Another thing that's weird about it is it shows up not in any theological text, but it's sort of sandwiched, or not sandwiched, it's added to the end of a copy of the Wonders of the East. So if you know your Beowulf manuscript, you'll know that the Wonders of the East is in there. That version does not have Yamnes and Mambres. It's in a different manuscript copy of the Wonders of the East that has much better pictures than the Beowulf one, frankly.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, but anyway, somebody felt the need to tack these guys on as like apparently as the final wonder, right? There's nothing in the manuscript to indicate that this is a separate or new text. In fact, they get their own magnificent full page picture, which I reproduce in the book and which I keep framed in my office for my own enjoyment.
Yeah, I'll have it
Um,
up on the screen here. That's a good one. I just
yeah,
used it in a tweet yesterday, actually.
it's so great. I mean, it's full page. We do not see full page illustrations with that much color. The colors are so
Hmm.
like jarring and vibrant. And this is what I argue in my article that'll come out in August. I think artistically we can see that the artist got carried away because this story was like so compelling to them, right?
Hmm.
In ways that might not seem obvious to us. But at any rate, in this text, it tells us that Yamnes has died for reasons unknown. He's been dead for a while. Mambres breaks out his brother's magical books and decides to use them to practice to do a necromancy, is what it says in Latin.
Hmm.
Fake it necromancium. I did not translate do a necromancy, but I think that's valid. Uh, anyway, so he calls up his brother, and I don't know what he hopes to get out of his dead brother, but what he does get. And if you are a younger sibling yourself, it will not surprise you that his dead brother comes back from hell to preach a sermon at him, right? To tell him how he screwed up and how he needs to get it together. Um, I'm the oldest sibling, so I can make fun of older siblings. At any rate, his brother comes back from hell and basically says, I've been in hell because I withstood Moses and Aaron, and I've done all this bad stuff, and it's cramped and it's terrible, and you're going to have the same fate if you don't treat your neighbors and your family better. And that's pretty much all he says. And that's like the end of the text. Like I've summarized the whole thing. It's only a paragraph. Um, it's in the book, I focus on the differences between the Latin and the Old English. In the Latin, they're called libros magicos, right? Magic books. And, you know, in late antiquity, magic could be positive or negative, right? There was a whole spectrum of learned magic that one could do. You know, think about the three magi, for instance, that come and see baby Jesus in the gospel narratives, right? You could be a mage and not be evil, right?
Yeah.
Um, you could be an astrologer or something scientific like that, right?
Hmm.
Um, In the Old English, though, the books are called Drulichenbech, right? Which the adjective dru, D-R-Y in Old English, seems to derive from the Old Irish dru, D-R-U-I, which is just the word for druid. I will throw it out there that like we don't know if Old English speakers would have been cognizant of the fact that dru came from Old Irish. Probably not, but they do seem to have consistently associated druidic magic with foreign magic, magic that belongs outside of English society. And when you look at the picture of Jamnes and Mambres out there, they're out in the heath, in the countryside. There's no other signs of human habitation around there, right? This is similar to the way that Alfred sometimes talks about witchcraft being practiced by women way out in the woods, right? Away from
Yeah.
towns, away from churches. This is why heathens are called heathens, right? They live in the heath. They do their bad stuff in the heath. Um,
I
out
went
there.
to a rabbit hole of penitentials when I was reading that section because I hadn't read them in a while, and it was interesting how many of them said like if you go out to a grove and like do some weird thing, like if you go out to a tree in the middle of nowhere and like bless it or something like that, like don't do that. And it was
Yeah,
very interesting how it all seems to be away from civilization, like into the
exactly.
wilderness.
And so there's this coming back to English conceptions of Englishness, right? There's this idea that we, Christian English people, are associated with cities or with or at least hamlets, right? Clusters of human habitation, however big or small. I mean, it's the early
Hmm.
Middle Ages, so like London was only 5,000 people or something. But at any rate, we are an urban people that have buildings and churches around, right? Like that's the ideal place to be. If you are the kind of person who's out there all alone on the windswept heath, that's not a good thing, right? Magic and monsters happen out there, right? I mean, so I think that's one layer of the kind of logic that we see with this apocryphal text, Penitence of Yamnes and Mambres, is it's appended to the end of the Wonders of the East because it's showing that, we've seen all the crazy exotic monsters that live in India and in the Far East and things like that, but we have them here too, right? And they're actually right next door, and they're also like Irish coded, or Norse coded, depending on which images you look at there.
I appreciate
So
your use of Gen Z terminology to redeem yourself after you said did a necromancy earlier and identified yourself as a millennial. But
yeah, I may be a
it's
millennial, but
correct usage.
I'm trying. Yeah. At any rate, yeah. Is that I
Yeah,
lost my train of thought.
so I was really interested. I mean, I think it's Emily Kessling is her name.
Yeah.
I appreciated the nod to that book that you give because I also was really interested to read what she had to say on it. And I would wonder if they had Latin texts that refer to the word druidos, because I think Caesar might be the only classical source, and he wasn't read in early medieval England. They didn't
Yeah,
really
that's
care about
exactly
what
right.
Caesar had
We
to
have
say.
no evidence that they
So
knew about it. Or
yeah, I
I don't know.
wonder if they would have even known what a druid was. Um,
It's hard to say. This is where we have to go into speculative mode. So my gut says it's not unlikely, and I do actually do a little bit of this footwork in the chapter. I tried not to really put my foot in it, but it it's not impossible. I mean, if you think about where some of these early English monks are being trained, a lot of them are going to places like Lindisfarne or even to foundations in Ireland and are being trained by Irish monks. If you hop over the water to Ireland and look at what the Irish monks are into, they love their own stories about druids and things like that, right? They've got all sorts of old Irish literature about druids like Caffa, right, who do all sorts of crazy magic. And even St. Patrick in certain strains of the legends about him is surprisingly violent, and he kills a lot of druids. And so like druids were like well known to Old Irish speakers for sure from these tales, probably both orally as well as in what survives in written form. It's hard for me to imagine living in that environment and never hearing about the cool stories that they're telling around the
yeah.
fire at night, right? Um, and I do point in my book to one little tiny speculative detail that Charlie Wright pointed to in his book on the Irish tradition in Anglo-Saxon England. It's an amazing book, and Charlie is one of those people who, if he says it's true, I believe it. he points to a tidbit in an Old English text, and I don't remember off the top of my head, but he where there seems to be indirect evidence of knowledge of the Tir Naveo, which is the land of the living, which is a sort of Irish mythical
Mm,
happy afterlife that this Old English text seems to know about, and it garbles the name slightly in such a way that it's probably Irish. We see lots of garbled Irish in Old English texts if you know to look for it.
yeah. I'll have to
I
look
think
into that.
there's
Sounds really interesting.
yeah. So there, I have the footnote in the book, and like I said, Charlie's book it covers all sorts of cool stuff like that.
Mm.
I'm trying to think another example off the top of my head. Oh, the King's. Do you know the Kingsmore ring?
Kingsmore Ring?
Yeah, it's a ring that was found in a seventh century tomb,
I'm not
um,
familiar, no.
and it is covered in runes all the way around. Actually, I usually wear it, but I put my Lord of the Rings rubber
Oh,
ring on it today. Um, but it's covered in It's got a runic inscription around it that for a long time people thought was just gibberish. And then who was that? Kaz Batten at University of Pennsylvania published a note on it a few years ago that I find extremely plausible. That says it's garbled Old Irish because the
mm,
runes begin with ar cru, which is like nothing in Old English, but
yeah.
it's perfectly good Old Irish for like against bleeding.
Mm,
So it seems to be a blood stanch charm is basically what Dr. Batten argues, and I think that's right. I think they're trying to copy Old Irish that they don't totally understand into runes to protect themselves, which is
that
fascinating,
word
right?
cru, so like cognate with Latin, like cruor, like
Exactly. Yeah.
cruens. Okay,
Yep.
interesting.
Yeah. And otter would just be the preposition that's like against or
Yeah,
something like that. So
fascinating.
yeah. Anyway,
Yeah,
for bleeding. Yeah, so I mean, we have good evidence of cultural interaction. I think for disciplinary and maybe even nationalistic reasons,
yeah,
across the 20th century, there hasn't been as much of that kind of study of looking at those
yeah.
interactions. But
I think
medievalists
the
are doing it now,
genetics.
right? Huh?
The genetics as well, if I'm not mistaken, really support that there was no sort of like everyone who's Britain like get out of here. Like there, it was like a huge mixing of
Yeah.
blood and stuff like that.
Iceland is the same deal, man. If you read Eastlanding, a book, Ari wants you to believe that they're all from Norway, but genetically, like we can tell that half the women were from Ireland. Um,
Oh wow,
yeah, the
I'd never
genes
heard that
don't lie.
before.
Yeah.
Wow.
So
Huh.
so again, I don't know. I don't want to project modernity onto the past where it's unwarranted, but I think some things stay the same, right? People have always
Yeah.
gotten around, people have always traveled, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes non-consensually, right? People have always mixed, right? These myths of purity, I think, are just that. They're just myths.
Mm.
They don't stand up to real lived experience now or back then. It's just when it's in the past, it's easier to look at the simplicity of our sources, which are fragmentary, and imagine that they're representative, when in fact there's a lot more that we don't have.
Yeah. Well, we are a little bit behind on time. I do want to bring up the next thing,
Yeah.
that being the Old English version of St. Paul, which I had read this one before, and I think it's really really cool. The idea, again, as you say, it's so funny that Paul says in the Bible, like, I'm not going to tell anyone what I saw, and then some monk was like, but what if he did? You know?
Yep. Yep.
Well,
Yeah. So the vision of
what's
Saint
going on with the Old English version specifically?
Yeah, so I will try to be brief because I know we are over time and you maybe have to edit this.
Oh no, we're fine, but
But so the two main hell texts that I look at in the book are the Vision of St. Paul and the Gospel of Nicodemus. The Gospel of Nicodemus is the one that is basically the harrowing of hell narrative. It's
mm,
what happens to Jesus after the crucifixion, but before the resurrection, right? He wasn't just sleeping in there. It turns out he actually raided hell and delivered all the Old Testament prophets and patriarchs, and it was
mm,
awesome. That's that. The vision of St. Paul is the illicit vision where Paul decides to change his mind and tell us what he did see after he was possibly stoned. We're not really sure. There's debate over what episode is even being referenced in First Corinthians, where he says he knows a guy that had a
yeah.
vision of the third heaven, right? But one tradition is that he had been stoned for preaching the gospel in a city, and as he's laying there mostly dying. Um, he has a vision and then he's brought back. But anyway, in any event, um, one thing that I love about looking at manuscripts of this text, by the way, whether they're in Latin or other languages, is that scribes will often like introduce the vision of Saint Paul with the verse from Corinthians. Um, I think as a way to authorize it, to say like this is important because it's referenced in the Bible, but
Yeah.
then ironically enough, they're like giving the proof text for why this text shouldn't exist. At any rate, in the Old English translation of it, right, and it basically is sort of the proto-Dante, right? Even as early as the mid to late 200s, we get Paul who is given a tour of heaven and then a tour of hell, and we see people getting sort of proportional punishment that sort of symbolically reflects their sin, right? Um, we see people who are liars. They're suspended from flaming trees by their tongues, right?
Yeah.
People who are fornicators are immersed in like fire up to their navel, right? Navel or umbilicus is a euphemism, a polite euphemism in Latin, right? It's not their belly button, but close enough. Anyway, so in the Old English version of it, it's actually fragmentary. It's only a couple of chapters of the full text, but it's basically what I argue is it's an early part of Paul's vision of hell. And in the Latin, as well as in the Old English, the sun, the moon, the stars, and the earth sort of tell God that they are sick and tired of people, which
That's
is a big deal.
hilarious.
Um, they're tired of our sin. They're tired of us just disrespecting. Like, why can't humans be cool and reverence God like we do, right? Um, it sort of taps into the late antique and medieval idea that beyond the moon, right, beyond the realm of the moon, everything is perfect and unfallen, and everything beneath the moon is subject to sin and chaos and entropy, right? So we've all got our act together. Won't you just let us, like the sun says, won't you let me hide my light so that they die? Or won't
Yeah.
the earth says, won't you let me withhold my vegetables, my wastum, so that they can
Yeah.
starve to death? Right? It's what they deserve. Um, And God says, no, 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 I'm giving them a chance, right? You're right that they really do suck, but I'm giving them a chance so that they can repent and so more of them will be saved, right? But what's
My
interesting,
favorite is the guardian angels saying like, please don't make us defend these people and follow them around all the time. They're so sinful. Like, please just let us go home.
well, and this is coming from like this weird apocryphal tradition that says that at the end of every day, this is one of the things that Paul says in the vision, why he's giving
Yeah.
it to us, is he thinks it's important that people know that at the end of every single day, we all have a guardian angel or two that watches over us individually, and as soon as we go to sleep, they fly up to heaven to narc on us and tell God what good and bad things we've done. Um,
Yeah.
so, and so, like, that's sort of like the justification in the third century for why this text is important is to like remind people to like be on your best behavior. You're always being watched, right? It's God's
Hmm.
panopticon. But it's in the Old English version of this, a lot of legal terminology is used, right? Words, phrases that we would see in Old English like law codes, basically. Um, and the complaints of the sun and the moon and the earth are sort of described just like you would expect an Old English lawsuit, where someone complains to a chieftain or a king about someone who has wronged them, and they're seeking recompense, they're seeking weregild or some kind of payback, right? Um, and so, one thing that I argue there is that the Old English, like, it's basically a legal metaphor. They're understanding sin and atonement through the lens of their own legal system, and they're looking at God as a judge in quite literal legal terms, right?
Yeah. It is. I had never considered that the first time I read it, and it is really striking once you pointed out um, the sort of angle that the translator takes. I do want to make a quick point. Again, we are kind of coming up on time. There are other works that you discussed in your Old English chapter.
Mhm.
One of the most interesting poems in the Old English corpus, in my opinion, commonly referred to as Christ and Satan, which is sort of like an antithesis to Milton's Paradise Lost, in that you get like it from Satan's perspective as he's in hell complaining about having just lost the sort of battle for heaven. Another one, The Descent into Hell, which is, I think it would be a little simplistic and to describe it as just a description of the harrowing of hell. There's a lot of stuff going on there. But then outside of that chapter, you also have chapters discussing a lot of different cultures in the early medieval period. As you've mentioned, the Irish traditions. as we've talked about, like, as well, the Norse traditions and a lot of different sort of case studies. What, though, would you say is the sort of general conclusion that you have come to in the sort of course of the book after looking at all these cultures and these traditions?
Yeah, that's a big question.
Yeah, not to put you on the spot.
No, no, no. I'm thinking. So one of the big takeaways that I arrive at is just the power that telling new stories about these old narratives has, right? Hell is something that is, it's in all the catechetical texts. Like as soon as you are of age as a Christian, you're supposed to know about it, and it sort of looms over everything. But when you get new texts that assign new meaning to it, like that can be really powerful. It can reshape the way that you see your fellow like citizens in your own little locality. It could reshape the way that you see cultural outsiders, right? If you think about Jamnes and Mambres and sort of the way that it paints um, witchcraft as somehow vaguely Irish, or the
Yeah.
way that the devils in Guthlac A speak Welsh, um,
Hmm.
or not Guthlac A, the Latin life of Guthlac. It's when we use these kinds of metaphors, um, it colors the way that we see other people in real life, right? And if for better and for worse, I think. And so just the power that is implicitly baked into uh, religious storytelling in particular, right? Because it's a lens through which we come to understand our own reality, right? I think that's one of the major takeaways that I had was just how much power is built into this sort of writing. Um, I would say another one though has to do with, to think about these people historically. I reflect a little bit on in the introduction on, well, what if I looked at other times and places, right? Would I find something similar or different about hell, right? In the way that it's being used to adapt ideas. Um, and I've read not that I can read Ethiopic or Syriac or Coptic, but I've read enough of those texts in Old Church Slavonic in translation to know that like on the one hand they were interested in a lot of the same questions, and I'm not going to say that the hell texts are identical, or that the changes that they make to them are identical, but they have the same sort of pattern of like an experimentation with hell in order to redefine either themselves or others, right? To help sort people in the world as like us and them, right? Um, so that category, right, or that sort of the power of storytelling again to reshape who belongs and who doesn't.
Yeah.
We see that at work in other times and places. The details shake out differently depending on where you are, right? Iceland doesn't convert until the year 1000. So,
Mhm.
the context is different from, say, Coptic Egypt in the 7th century, of course, right?
Yeah.
Um, they might want different things out of their hells, in other words. But the fact is, in both contexts, hell is a useful engine for reconfiguring or experimenting with notions of identity and belonging.
Yeah. Well, folks, Professor Hopkins' book, Translating Hell, is available. I'll have the link in the pinned comments for anyone who wants to check that out. I really recommend it. It was an entertaining read. You've got a great style and a lot of texts that I had never heard of before, especially in the other traditions. And it was really cool to learn about that stuff. So can't recommend it enough.
Thanks very much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on the channel.